Everyone, welcome to my channel, The Enthusiast Mechanic. Today we got ourselves a good one. We have a 2022 Ford F350 dually where that customer states brakes just started making noise. However, when I get in the truck, I'm greeted with this sitting on the floor. This looks like a brake pad that is no longer a pad, and let's see, where is it gone? From there. So customer waited too long. This guy I know does a lot of towing and hauling, so he wears out his brakes, and fortunately he just didn't get to me on time. Alright, so the first step in this that I like to do is get rid of these. Now what you're going to need is a tool like this. It's a 1/2-inch slim socket with an extension, because if you had a regular socket like I have here, as you can clearly see, you won't be able to fit. So the way we do it is we put our tool on here, and obviously that goes there, and let's begin. So now that we got all the bolts off, now we're going to use a hammer. You don't really need the biggest hammer on here. This truck is fairly new. It's only a couple months old at best with 20-some thousand miles. So what I do is just tap it. So now that we got the hub off, we're going to be removing the 21 millimeters that hold out the caliper bracket. If you're just replacing pads and you're not doing rotors on this, you don't really have to remove the hub, and you don't have to remove this bracket. You would just unbolt it here, get your pads in and out, and you'd be done. Since we're replacing the caliper, I'm opting to just remove it from the bracket. So let's get this done. Alright guys, so we're ready to replace the caliper now. If you're not replacing a caliper on the car, basically on these, after you remove the hub, remove the caliper with the bracket, you basically slide on your new rotor, put the hub back on, bolt up your caliper, and then basically put on your pads and go from there. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to lock down the fluid line with these. Now these are a Lyle tool, I believe. They are called line locks. They are very, very useful so you don't make a mess. A lot of people don't like to use these. Some people like to use them. They say they damage the brake hose. What I found out is you don't want to crank on this, guys. You don't want to just, give it a whirl. You just go enough, it gets tight, and then you're in good shape. You should be able to block out most of the fluid. So now we're going to remove the line, and I am going to be using my Milwaukee impact. Now, you do not install a caliper with the impact. I'm just doing this to remove the line. I will not be installing the line with this. So you just zip it off. Now this is a 15 millimeter. We already have our line lock, so we shouldn't get a lot of brake fluid coming out. And what you want to make sure is that if you notice here, the copper gasket is there. You remove the copper gasket off your line, and then the new caliper will have new hardware. So what I like to do is I just put that back in there. Helps keep it not making a mess. And you also want to remember which way you took this off, because when you put it on, you don't want to manipulate it in a way that it doesn't fit. I know sometimes it possibly won't be able to be done that way, but sometimes where there's a will, there's a way. Someone will do it. So what I like to do is just lay that down, and then what you can do is remove your caliper, and that's the removal of the caliper. So on these Ford hubs, what I like to do, just being me, is you want to basically add Loctite to the portion that holds your hub into place. I believe Ford had some sort of technical service bulletin regarding this, so I just make it a means to use some blue Loctite to keep everything in order. So what you want to do basically is grab your Loctite. I use the stick formation of it, and you just want to do a line on it. You don't have to really go all the way up, but I find that it helps take more in to lock it down a little bit better. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be adding the Loctite to this now. I'm going to be cleaning my hub face and flange area for the new rotor, and then I'll be right back with you guys to show you the next step. So now that I got my rotor installed and I got my Loctite on there, I went ahead and I cleaned my hub surface, the flange, and I also cleaned the hub portion. So what we're going to be doing now is putting it back together. So what we do is just slide it on. Now it takes a little bit of finessing, and you can put it on there. So once we have that set up, what we're going to do is we're going to be getting all of our bolts. And I always like to tell people, and I can't stress this enough, always spin these on by hand. Do not just take your impact and go to town on them, because if you do that, you will encounter an issue. Okay guys, now that I've installed my rotor and I have torqued my hub and everything, I just want to point out one thing that might help you guys out. There are quite a few bolts on this, and sometimes you do have to alternate your pattern. So what I like to do is I go on hand tight. I make sure I go corner to corner, side to side, make sure it's seated properly. Then I do my torquing procedure. And then what I do is after I torque a bolt, I just make a white paint mark. That way I know I got to that one and I don't have to keep rerunning them. So now we're going to get ready to mount our caliper. Now, in case you guys forgot, we do have our line hanging out here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is grab our caliper, which is right here. Now, one quick way to know which caliper goes where is normally the bleeders are facing up. Normally, I would tell people to pay attention to this, but it's always the bleeder that's facing up. So what we're doing here is we're going to grab a bolt. These come with blue Loctite from the factory, so I went ahead and I added some on there. We're going to slide it on, and once we slide it on, it's very important to make sure you start hand threading it. If you just go at this with an impact, it will strip threads. Ask me how I know. I've maybe done it a few times. Paid the piper, I've learned my lesson. I always make sure I thread by hand and get a good couple threads, and what I also do is I pull on it just to make sure that we got a good connection. So I'm going to go ahead and torque those bolts down. So now that I have bolted my bracket and caliper on here, what I'm going to be doing to make this easier for myself is I always loosen the bottom one and I slide the caliper off. So most cars you can keep the caliper up here. In this case it doesn't swing all the way. So what I'm going to do is just briefly remove it just so you guys can kind of see what I'm doing. So let's put this to the side. Now that we have the caliper out of the way, what we do is we're going to be sliding in our pads. So I tell people do not touch the material, so you want to do your best to keep your grease and stuff out there, and that's what you do right there. Let's do the inboard one. Now I will admit this stage can be a little bit of a pain for some. If you have a new setup like mine where we have new calipers and we have new rotors and everything, it slides on just like that. It all depends on your preparation, guys. If you clean these up very well, you will be able to slide them in and out fairly easy. You never want to have to force these in there. These should always slide pretty freely. So now we have our caliper. Now again, typically this is mounted onto the car, but since we're replacing calipers on this car, it is in my hand, so we're going to be installing it right now. As we did previously, now I will be making a video on how to prep a caliper, or at least my way of prepping a caliper. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and slide this on. So typically this will stay in the car when the line is attached to it. You'll just kind of leave it up here. I prefer to hang them, that way it's safer. But for this video purpose, I had to take it off because we are replacing the caliper. So I will show you in another video that I'm going to upload later on how to prep the caliper, but for now we're going to slide your retaining bolt on here. Alright guys, so we got our caliper mounted on here, everything is torqued. Next we got to put the brake line on. New calipers always come with this plug in there, at least they should. If it doesn't have a plug on there, I'd be very skeptical as to using it, because that means something could have entered the caliper, be it water, dirt, anything, and you definitely don't want that inside of your system. So what I like to do here to prep is I take my rag and you basically clean off your brake line, make sure you got no dirt, no debris on there, and get this thing prepped and ready as you just wipe it off. And then what I like to do is get my trusty pocket knife. Now this thing has seen its good days and its bad days. As you can see, it's pretty damaged, but the way it's broken actually helps with this. I just go here and I do that. So once you remove that, what you want to do is also do the same thing on here. Make sure that the surface is nice and clean. So now that I got my hardware, what you want to do is basically you got a bolt, 2 washers. Every caliper should come with these. What you want to do is put one on the bolt head, and then the way I like to do this is I've already cleaned off everything and wiped everything good. So I place this here. Now this is where you got to be careful. Remember, Certain brake lines only go in a certain way. On this particular car, this kind of guides you because you can't really flop this around. I mean, I guess you could if you really wanted to, but it's highly unlikely that you can, put this on backwards. So after you got your washer on there, you put your other washer on the back. And again, I've already pre-wiped all my surfaces. They are clean. Now, key thing to take away from this is make sure that you always put these on by hand. What I've seen a lot of people do is they will just go crazy and they won't do it by hand and they'll just use a gun. If you do that, you can strip them. Trust me, I've done it a few times. So I run it down by hand all the way down. And then what I do is I get everything torqued up. Now that everything is torqued, my whole bracket, my caliper, my hub, everything is torqued, lube, everything's good to go. You wanna remember to remove your line lock if you used one. So you take this off before you bleed your brakes, because if you leave it on there, well, you could crack this bleeder all day depending on the sealing of this. You will not get any fluid coming out, or you'll partially get fluid, and it just makes for not a good time. So once we get that off, what I like to do is, now some people don't use those, like I said earlier, because they feel they crimp the line. I always just kind of touch the line here and just make sure that it's not fully squeezed. And obviously I don't crank them down to the point where that'll happen. Take your pick. Some people love them, some people hate them. It all really depends on who's doing it. This is just my way of doing it. You always want to be mindful to make sure that the brake line is not contacting anything. Make sure you got your clearances. Alright, so we have both calipers done on both sides along with the rotors and pads. Now, if you were doing this manually bleeding, what you would be doing is filling up the brake fluid. As you can see, I filled it up, kind of overflowed. I don't know if you guys can see that or not. But essentially what you want to do is fill it up, and if you're manually bleeding these, you would have someone inside the car that would be pushing on the pedal to build up the pressure, and then they would have to hold down the brake pedal, and then you would open up the bleeder screw, which I'll show you here in a second. That's on the caliper, to bleed out the air, and you basically just continue that for however long it takes for you to get all the air out and fluid to come through. Since I work in the shop, we have a power brake bleeder. Now, this is not going to apply to a lot of you guys. I do this professionally for a living every day, so we have an automatic bleeder. So I'm going to put my adapter on here, put my line on, and I'm going to proceed to bleeding. So I know a lot of you are probably wondering how I do it with the power bleeder. So it's pretty simple. You guys saw up top that I connected my adapter. There's a line that quick connects to the adapter, and then we have our tank here. What this does basically is have the brake fluid in here. It pumps air through the bottom. It's a bladder system, and therefore it'll supply brake fluid to the system via this hose. If you're a professional mechanic doing this every day, this is a must-have. I work alone. There's no one here to pump brakes for me or do any of that, so I basically employ as many tools as I can that help make my life a little bit easier, although these are not cheap to get into, so your average everyday DIYer is not going to have this. Usually professional shops will have it. It's a really good tool, but like I said, if you don't have this setup, you can still do it. It's a little bit of a different process. You're going to need two people, but it's definitely doable. If you go online, they do have many kits that you can basically hook up to the caliper and suction it out via a compressor. But again, for that you will need a compressor. Okay guys, so I've set up my brake bleeder setup. Now what we're going to do, just not to make a mess, I prefer to do it this way. You obviously want to keep as clean as you can, because brake fluid is corrosive. You do not want to get it on your paint. I have this bleeder bottle. You attach it to the bleeder, and essentially has a bottle, collects everything. And now we have our power bleeder set up there. So what we're going to do is just open it, and you guys can probably see we have some flow on the line here. Now it may be difficult to pick up on camera, but you can see my fluid canister is filling up. Now I like to do these up until I get about a quarter of the bottle filled up, and until I don't see any air bubbles in the line anymore. So what I like to do is, after I see that, I go ahead and just lightly close it and make sure this is a little loose on there. Then I crack it open one more time, and I'm paying attention to the fluid here. Again, it's clear. I see brand new brake fluid coming out. So I'm going to go ahead and just snug that up. You want to be careful with these. As you can see, it's very easy to break these guys. You don't want to hammer them down too tight, just enough to where it seals. I use a wrench, I snug them, and then I use a ratchet just to make sure that they are tight. Alright everybody, so we are inside the truck now. After you put the brakes and you clean up and you put your tires on, a lot of people always seem to forget, and I just want to make sure that everybody does this. If you service your brakes, you want to pump your pedal before you move the vehicle. If you don't, you'll put it into gear, you'll either reverse or go forwards, and you're going to pump the brakes and you're not going to have a brake pedal. So what I like to do is before the car even leaves. So now that we've checked for leaks and there are no leaks here, I always just generally go over, make sure everything is tight, check your brake hose, make sure things like this are together in case they came off when you touched it and moved it around. One thing that I do want to mention to people that usually does help, if your bleeder screw comes with a little cap, dust boot, definitely put it on. Now here in the Midwest, it doesn't really help you out too much because once this thing hits the road and it goes through a winter or two, usually these are a bear to take off. There are methods to take them off, but usually they wind up breaking. It's about a 50-50 shot, at least where I'm from. We do use salt heavily when it comes down to winters. I also want to talk to you guys a little bit about cleanliness when you're working on vehicles. I work in a professional shop. I do this for a living. I always make sure that I work on my customers' vehicles like I am working on my own vehicle. You always want to be clean, you want to be courteous, and obviously just get the job done, do it right, and not give the customer any headaches. Cleanliness is super important, especially on a job of this nature. As you guys can probably see here, there's a little bit of brake fluid there. I spilled when I removed my adapter from my brake bleeder. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and clean all that up before I give it back to the customer. Alright guys, so this wraps up our video on 2022 Ford F350 dually front brakes. Like I said, everything that we did on this side easily transfers to the other side. It would make no sense to show you guys both sides. It's identically the same thing. So just take what you learned here and apply it to the other side. It's exactly the same. With that said, I do want to tell people that these are just my methods. I'm not necessarily always right. I may not do everything by the book, but this is how I've been doing it for years, and I've never really had issues. If you guys want to know anything, just let me know down in the comments, and I'll try to reply to you as fast as I can.